Okay, in this lecture video, we're going to talk about acids and look at some definitions and what they really are. So there are actually lots of definitions for acids, and in our class, we're going to look at two. The first one is that an acid is a substance that releases H+, which we know is a proton, in water. So that means it's a chemical that has hydrogen in its chemical formula, and that hydrogen gets released as a proton when put in water. The second definition of an acid is that it donates an H+ to another substance. And we'll look at that one a little bit more closely in the other prep activity that you're going to do. But for now, let's focus on definition number one. So here's a couple of examples. So in the first example, we have hydrochloric acid, which when you dissolve it in water, releases that H+ cation, that proton, and a chloride anion. So that's what defines HCl as an acid. Hydrofluoric acid is another example. And when you dissolve HF in water, it too releases an H+ cation or a proton and a fluoride anion. So it is the release of these protons that make both of these molecules acids, but they are different types of acids. So we would consider HCl to be a strong acid. So that means when you put it in water, all of the HCl molecules break apart into H+ and Cl-. So we would call hydrochloric acid also a strong electrolyte, okay, because it completely breaks apart. HF, on the other hand, is a weak acid. So that means when you put it in water, most of the molecules stay together. It still releases a few protons, making an acid by definition, but most of the molecules stay together. So HF is a weak acid, much like and a weak electrolyte as well, since most of the molecules stay together. So that's similar to acetic acid that we looked at in our electrolyte video. It also turns out that when you have a molecule that has hydrogens in it, that not all of the H+ in the acid are acidic. So let's take acetic acid as our example. That was the one, again, that we looked at in the electrolyte video. And if I were to take acetic acid and draw a structure, it would look like this. And it turns out that the only proton, the only hydrogen out of the 4 hydrogens in this molecule that is acidic is this one. So we call that an acidic hydrogen. So that means when you put acetic acid in water, it breaks apart into H+. So that's the one that I have circled there. And then what's left over is everything else. So CH3, COO-. So that would be our acetate anion, which is just a polyatomic anion. So even though there are lots of hydrogens in this molecule, only one of them is acidic and actually gets released when that acid is put into water. We can also have acids with multiple protons that get lost when put into water. So one example of a monoprotic acid is hydrochloric acid. So mono meaning one, and protic meaning proton, or 1H+. Diprotic, on the other hand, di means 2, so 2 protons that get released when sulfuric acid, H2SO4, is dissolved in water. So in this first equation that we have, here's our first proton being released. And then you get HSO4-, that's everything that's left after that proton gets released. And remember, even though we're breaking apart into ions here when that proton gets released and you get left with the leftover anion, in the original molecule, these are covalent bonds. So there are no ions present in this acid molecule. But when you put it in water, you release protons and you generate ions. So in this diprotic acid, after you generate your first anion, That anion, HSO4-, also has an acidic proton that can subsequently be lost in the water solution to yield H+ or proton and our polyatomic sulfate ion. So it turns out that when that H+ gets released into the solution, it doesn't just float around by itself. So really what happens is that H+ is going to attach itself to the water molecule that the acid was dissolved in. So if we look at hydrochloric acid, for example, we know that when it breaks apart, it releases the H+ and the chloride anion. And I'm going to draw that water molecule now that H+ attaches to. So I'll show the original two hydrogens from the water molecule in blue, and then I'm going to add my third hydrogen atom as red, because that's the one that came from the hydrochloric acid. So then I can go ahead and add my charge because we've added an extra hydrogen now. So we have now a positively charged chemical species. It was neutral and I've added a proton. Then I can finish out my Lewis structure here, and I have a polyatomic cation that's called the hydronium ion. So I can also write the chemical formula here as H3O+, and that's a water molecule that now has an extra proton attached to it that came from an acid dissolved in solution.